thank you all for being here. I'm Jake Grumbach. I'm an associate professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley. Great to be here, introducing this panel on democratic backsliding in the United States. I'm part of the BESI initiative, and we're here in the social science matrix. Thanks to Eva Cito over here for work organizing. And first, I'll introduce all our panelists first, and then kick it off for them to sort of introduce their remarks, and then we'll do some Q&A. So first here is Jonathan Gould, the class of 1965 professor of law at UC Berkeley, class of 1965, incredible music. His research focuses on the relationship between politics and the law, with special attention to Congress and the legislative process. He draws on a variety of methods and literatures, including public law, political theory, political science, and more. Gould's scholarship has been published or is forthcoming in all the flagship law reviews, as well as many peer-reviewed journals. Next on the list, we have Eric Schickler. He's the Jeffrey and Ashley McDermott Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, IGS, here at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on the US Congress, American political development, political parties, and polarization. He's the author of 3 books, which have won the Richard Fenno Jr. Prize: Disjointed Pluralism, Institutional Innovation and the Development of the US Congress, Filibuster, as well as Investigating the President with Douglas Kreiner. Then we have Paul Pearson, the John Gross Distinguished Professor of Political Science at University of California, Berkeley. He's the director of the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, BESI, and serves as co-director of the Consortium on the American Political Economy. His research, which focuses on the American political economy and public policy, has been awarded several major prizes from the APSA, American Political Science Association, and is the author or co-author of 7 books, including the best-selling Winner Take All Politics, co-authored with Jacob Hacker. His latest book with Eric Schickler is Partisan Nation: The Dangerous New Logic of American Politics in a Nationalized Era. Next, we have Susan Hyde, class of 1959 chair and Robeson Professor of Political Science. She also co-directs the Institute of International Studies here at UC Berkeley. She studies international influences on domestic politics and global threats to democracy. Hyde is an expert on international election observation, election fraud, democracy promotion, and international norms. And she's worked for the Carter Center, the National Democratic Institute, Democracy International, the International Republican Institute, and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems on democracy promotion issues around the world. Thanks to all our panelists for being here and taking the time to provide their expertise. We'll start with John Gould, a law professor and constitutional law professor, to tell us about what a constitutional crisis is and whether we're in one, maybe more. Take it away, John.
Thank you so much, and it's terrific to be here, and I wish we didn't have the occasion to be together, but conditional on having the occasion, I'm really glad to take part with this distinguished panel. I want to give a little bit of legal framework on the question of whether we're in a constitutional crisis. The answer is it depends what you mean by constitutional crisis, and it depends on the day, because things are, of course, moving quickly. But I want to take a few minutes to focus my remarks on some kind of big picture questions, things that I think are of note that have happened, things that I am looking out for in the weeks and months ahead. And then I'll very quickly roll through a couple of examples at the end. I won't have time to fully treat the examples, but want to put a few examples on the table that I'm happy to come back to in the Q&A if folks want to pick up on any of them. So just by way of roadmap, kind of starting with how do we think about the rule of law, kind of various understandings of the rule of law, then thinking about judicial disobedience. This is the question of kind of what would it mean for the executive branch to disobey a court order, which is a question of particular note. Then I'll go to a few case studies and then close with some lessons. And I'm gonna stand only because it's easier to see the slides until there's a court order telling me not to. So what do we mean by the rule of law? I think the term is frequently used and often used sloppily. So I want to put on the table a few different things that we might mean, all of which are important, but which don't always move together. We can be doing better on one and worse on others. And I just want to kind of put these ideas of the rule of law together on the table for us to think about. So one idea, and a kind of simplest idea, is just government is doing something unlawful. This happens in every administration. There are things that the government does that intentionally or unintentionally cross legal bounds? Is the nature of the executive branch to push the limits of authority? I think in the last couple of weeks, we have seen illegality of a scale that we have not seen previously. But nonetheless, kind of one way to think about about a rule of law problem is just how many unlawful things are happening. That can't be the full picture, though. I don't think any of us would say there's a rule of law problem if, say, a federal agency does its best to comply with the law, succeeds 99 times out of 100. Very few of us would say the 100th time is a rule of law problem. So bare illegality, while really important and while something to watch for, is not the only indicator and not the only thing we should care about. A second prong, which I think is really important, is disrespect for legal constraints. So it obviously is often, though not always, a prerequisite for inequality that just you don't care if it's legal or not. You don't vet your executive orders with the Department of Justice. You don't go through ordinary process. You say things, as members of this administration have, along the lines of, I can do what I want irrespective of the law. Sometimes there's a kind of latent inchoate Article 2 theory behind that. Sometimes there's just not. Sometimes there's just, I do what I can get away with. So I think a big part of rule of law anxiety should arise not just are there unlawful things happening, but what are the sets of attitudes toward what's happening? And on that score, I think we're doing pretty poorly. A third anxiety about the rule of law, especially with regard to prosecutorial power or other forms of state repression, is government acting for the right sets of reasons? So presumably, the cop pulling people over should be pulling over people who are driving dangerously, not on the basis of race. So too, tax audits should be done based on people where there's reasonable reason to think something irregular is happening, not on the basis of partisan affiliation. So I'm really going to be watching for, and some of the DOJ memos lately bring real anxiety on this, kind of, will there be a weaponization? Will kind of wrongful reasons be animating the enforcement, both civil and criminal, of American law? And then fourth is this idea of checks on public power. And not everyone puts this under the rule of law heading, but I think it's important. This idea that rule of law means that no actor is completely unaccountable. And I think we're seeing kind of testing of the system by the newly sworn in Trump administration around kind of, are there actual checks? And I'm going to talk more about judicial checks. Legislative checks during times of united government are weaker than under times of divided government, and I know others will be getting to those. One particular thing to watch is the prospect of judicial disobedience, of the executive branch disobeying the courts. And this is something that's gotten a lot of attention lately. The vice president has been tweeting about it with the word legitimate in the last sentence there is doing a great deal of work around what type of disobedience we may or may not see. So I just want to note kind of a few different flavors of judicial disobedience so we can kind of, when you see the Times say he's disobeying the court, kind of think about what exactly is happening. The first is lower court orders versus the Supreme Court. Now, I think lower court injunctions are sometimes ambiguous with respect to geographic scope. What we've seen thus far are TROs, temporary restraining orders, which are kind of short-term orders. And it really depends kind of what is the thing being disobeyed. That if it's an order out of one state and you choose not to comply in other states, that's a problem on the conventional understanding, but is not as big a problem as outright, say, ignoring a US Supreme Court decision. So I think that axis matters. A second is disobedience overt and covert? And I don't want to say either of these is better or worse, because both are tremendously worrisome from a rule of law perspective, but the political dynamic is quite different. The dynamic, on the one hand, of the president getting up and saying, I'm not going to obey the court, versus the president maybe gesturing toward obedience, but in the practice of the bureaucracy or in the practice of how things happen in government, just not kind of going through with it in a way that might fly beneath the radar. Again, neither justifiable, but very different legal and political dynamics. And the third is there a justification offered, and is it plausible? If there were a justification, it would presumably be something along the lines of the court actually didn't have jurisdiction or misunderstood the relevant constitutional language. This gets into pretty fundamental debates about what's called judicial supremacy, the idea that the courts have the last word on matters of law, and what's often called departmentalism, the idea that each branch has the power to interpret the Constitution for itself. I think what we will be seeing in the coming months is a kind of extreme departmentalist approach on the part of executive branch lawyers, which courts, we'll see what the reactions are. I think we don't exactly know what they'll be, which brings me to this question of kind of responses. So what are we going to get? One answer is judicial capitulation, that the executive branch starts acting, establishing facts on the ground, and courts just go along with it. One reason for that could be agreement on the merits. I think on some issues of presidential removal power, courts simply agree on the merits with some of the things that the Trump administration has done or will do. But some might be out of fear. There's reasons to think that courts are very anxious about issuing orders that can be ignored. And courts, because they have neither purse nor sword, as the Federalist tells us, are in an especially weak position to enforce their own orders. So there's a question about whether they will capitulate on some things out of fear of being ignored, which is obviously itself a significant rule of law problem, different in kind from them fighting against the president and being ignored, but rather them fighting for the president even when they wish they didn't have to. I'm watching judicial contempt orders. To the extent to which there's disobedience of court orders, will cabinet secretaries or other agency personnel be held in contempt? If they are held in contempt, what then? I do not think we are likely to see cabinet secretaries being dragged off to jail, but it's not an impossible thing. And these questions around kind of who blinks first, the courts or the executive branch. There's a question of whether we'll see congressional responses, which I'll defer to other panelists. But Congress, obviously, if it chose to exercise them, has an enormous number of tools at its disposal to try to exert leverage on the executive branch, from the power of the purse to oversight hearings to not confirming nominees. Thus far, Congress has really acquiesced in early executive branch moves. We'll see if that continues. Then the question of a public response. Will we see people taking to the streets? Again, thus far has been pretty muted, but it's not impossible to imagine that we would see much more collective action. And for any of these, there's also the question of kind of what's the executive branch counter move? That if there's a kind of move of pushback, whether by the courts or by Congress or by the public, what does the executive branch do? And I gestured at that in the contempt context, but we can imagine it in any of these contexts. So that's a kind of big picture framework. I'm going to very briefly go through a couple of case studies. And again, I could do an hour on any of these, and I'll just say a word or two, and happy to take more in Q&A. Great, so we're going to get all the current anxieties about governance in 3 minutes. So one set of anxieties is politicizing law enforcement. We've seen worrisome signs from the Department of Justice, from the FBI, and I'll just note it can be really hard to push back against certain types of political repression. I think we saw kind of a recognition of that with the preemptive pardons done by the Biden administration, that showing kind of getting cases thrown out on the grounds they're politically motivated is really hard. Other types of oversight are really hard. So that's one thing I'm watching. A second is questions around the status of the civil service. We've seen layoffs, buyouts, reclassifications, funding freezes. And I think the key thing we've seen is chaos. The law of the civil service is extremely complicated. In some areas, the civil servants have a great number of protections. There have already been some injunctions favoring them. In other areas, the executive might be on stronger footing. And I think we're going to be seeing months, if not years, of litigation kind of working out the civil service implications. Impoundment, this is declining to spend funds. We had an executive order. We had judicial injunctions against it very quickly. We had partial noncompliance with the injunctions and real uncertainty about what's going to happen going forward. And I'll note with impoundment looming over all of this is this constitutional question. So impoundment, this is not, so the president not spending funds that have been appropriated, is in violation of a statute passed in the 1970s. The position of the Trump administration is that that statute is not constitutional. I assume this issue will eventually make its way up to the court, but it might take some amount of time. We have the TikTok issue, which was front pages 3 weeks ago, but feels like ancient history given all that has happened. But that is in some way the clearest example. Bipartisan statute upheld by a unanimous Supreme Court, and the president seems to be expressly flouting the statute. And we've largely seen quiet for now, though we'll see if he flouts it beyond the 75-day delay, what ends up happening there. And finally, birthright citizenship. We have provision of the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the US and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. We have an executive order that goes against the plain text and longstanding precedent interpreting this provision. And we have a judicial order enjoining the executive order, which has held thus far, but again, we'll see how far that gets. So in terms of broader lessons, I want to just note 5 things quickly. First, big disjuncture from the first Trump administration. Things are happening faster with greater recklessness and disregard for legality than we saw in Trump 1. This makes many of the things that were front page headlines in Trump 1 look like child's play. Second, considerable future uncertainty. things could get either better or worse. This is a situation with some upside and tremendous downside, and we just do not know where they are going. 3, I think we're seeing the executive testing limits. I think this is part of a strategy by President Trump to see what he can get away with, which then puts the onus on courts, Congress, and the public to see what the pushback will be. I think we're seeing and will continue to see some of the institutional weaknesses of the courts and Congress and their ability to push back. And I'll just note that democratic backsliding and rule of law violations finally have kind of a fast version and a slow version. I think on some of these issues, we might see things happen very, very quickly. On others, it may be more of a slower erosion over time. And we need to track kind of each issue individually to get a sense of the whole with which we're dealing. So again, a grim picture. I'm sorry not to be ending with happy news, but I'm really glad to be here with all of you and look forward to discussing.
Thank you, John. Next to tell us about Congress, the first branch of government, Eric Schickler. Thanks.
Let's see. All right, I'm going to try to do this without from sitting down here. We'll see how it works. So, Jonathan laid out, I think, kind of the fundamental questions exceptionally well and clearly. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the congressional side, but not go on too long to leave time, especially for both for my fellow panelists, but also such a great crowd. I think, really eager to hear your questions. I should also note I'm going to be drawing on my co-authored work with Paul Pearson, Partisan Nation. That's provides a lot of the analytical frame for what I'm talking about now. So what we've seen, as Jonathan talked about, is just an extraordinary assertion of unilateral executive power by President Trump in these first few weeks. Examples such as impoundment, firing the more than a dozen inspectors general without complying with the law requiring legal notice, threats to withhold funds and dissolve entire agencies. I mean, this is major unilateral action. And what we've seen is basically no response from congressional Republicans. I have to look at it, otherwise I'll be craning my neck too much. We've also seen, of course, these extreme nominees confirmed. And I think it's worth stepping back. And in November, December, as the nominations were being made and Matt Gaetz sort of fell by the wayside, I think people were thinking, oh, well, maybe a few of these others who are especially extreme are going to fail. And, we clearly, Pete Hegseth with the sexual assault accusation, as well as many other, questions about him confirmed, Vought in the OMB with unanimous Republican support after explicitly favoring this impoundment theory of not spending money. So no significant pushback or criticism from congressional Republicans and very little effective pushback from Democrats. And I think what I want to say about this is that we shouldn't really view what's happening on the Congress side in its response to Trump as particularly surprising in light of what's been going on in recent years. But I think we should see it as very surprising if we think in terms of the arc of American history. In other words, this has been building for a long time, but is radically different from what we had before. And I think a nice example, just to make that clear, is thinking about the response in Congress to Nixon, when he asserted an impoundment power that was actually less sweeping than Trump, but did refuse to spend appropriated funds on programs he opposed. And Congress responded by passing the Budget Act of 1974. That vote, as Jonathan alluded to, banned impoundments, among other, while also remaking Congress's budget process, passes the Senate with unanimous Republican support and the House with a big bipartisan vote. And this ends up being signed by Nixon because he wouldn't have had the votes to overcome a veto, right? So this is bipartisan cooperation to defend Congress's power. We also, Paul and I talk a lot in the book about the politics of Nixon's impeachment, where early in the process, a small number of Republicans basically legitimate the investigation, take part in the investigation, express concern about Nixon's actions. Now, there was still a lot of partisanship. Most Republicans stood by Nixon at first, but you had some voices of prominent people among Republicans who objected and for example, called for the appointment of a special prosecutor. And then when Nixon fired that prosecutor in a small handful of cases, called for his resignation. That sent a signal to the public that this is not just a partisan exercise, and created a kind of cascade where eventually, by the end, you get not only a third of House Republicans on the committee voting for impeachment, but crucially, Barry Goldwater, arch-conservative senator, goes to Nixon and says, if you see this out, there aren't a dozen votes to prevent conviction. You're gonna be convicted, right? And so we didn't see a bipartisan vote because we didn't have to, but that was a case of cross-party cooperation to defend our institutions. All right, clearly that's not what we have today. Instead, we have a situation where checks in the system are undermined by strong parties operating across institutions. So the US Republican system of government is based on this idea in Madison Federalist 51, the ambition of the person is tied to the power of their office. And the idea is that where you sit, like in other words, what your office is, will give you a stake in that office's power, and you will stand up for those powers when it's threatened by one of the other branches, right? And our argument in the book is that the development of nationalized polarization has undercut that dynamic. And so today, where you sit and where you're from matters far less than party. And as a result of that, when individual members, in particular Republican members, today do not see the stake in defending Congress's power and institutional prerogatives. And that's a big contrast to how this republic has worked for essentially 200 years. And so we draw one, I think, really nice example of this is to think about the dynamics in the New Deal era when Franklin Roosevelt, in an immense crisis, develops incredible power. But for example, when he tries to unilaterally get power to reorganize the executive branch, that gets branded the dictator bill and is turned back by a Congress, a Democratic-controlled Congress, by bipartisan coalition, and end up approving something much, much weaker in the end that builds in congressional authority. You also had serious oversight of Roosevelt during World War II by this under a Democratic-controlled Congress, and that's just not what we see today. And just to give you one quick example of this dynamic today, with great fanfare, just a month ago, Joni Ernst launched the Inspector General's Caucus, Republican senator from Iowa, 5 senators to stand up for the important role that inspectors general play in rooting out corruption. These are appointees, presidential appointees, but protected from being fired because their job is to basically scrutinize what's going on within the executive branch to deal with malfeasance, corruption, maladministration. Trump fires more than a dozen inspector generals, and you see this headline, Trump firing of watchdogs gives early test to new Senate caucus. Well, how do they respond to that test? Well, you have to look really hard to see a response from Joni Ernst, but here was her statement from a spokesperson. She looks forward to learning more about this decision and working with the president to nominate replacements so the important work of independent investigators will continue with full transparency, right? So entirely caving in, just entirely, right? All right, so stepping back, when Congress has faced challenges to its role in our system in the past, and when that's happened in prior eras, you saw cross-party coalitions launch reforms. So when I was in grad school, this book that had come out maybe about 5-10 years earlier, Decline and Resurgence of Congress by James Sundquist, traced some of those dynamics with the response to the imperial presidency in Vietnam and the War Powers Act as one example, the Budget Act as another. But each of those resurgences depended on members of Congress of the president's own party defending the institution, right? And that's the basis for those kinds of coalitions is just severely eroded. And that's true in some extent for each party. They're both, each party's members are now responsive to a common groups, similar sets of groups, donors, and networks across states and localities. But it's especially acute for Republicans, where the fear of taking on Trump is palpable. And people talk about it in terms of a primary threat, now potentially funded by Elon Musk. And that's a big part of it. But there's also just a threat of having your life made miserable by armies of online activists mobilized by Musk and by Trump, calling your home, giving threats to your family. And that, even for relatively electorally secure Republicans, is having a clear impact and undercutting this kind of checking response. And so this is just creates this dynamic that Jonathan outlined, where if you ask, well, why isn't Congress resisting? Well, we have unified party control and a party in which there are essentially no members who are willing to openly take on the president because of these changed political incentives. And it's going to require that external events change those political incentives in order for us to see any kind of response. And so maybe we can talk about those dynamics during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you to Eric Strickler. Next up is Paul Pearson. Would you like to make, for continuity, go up?
Thanks, Eva. I feel like I've been in lots of conversations one-on-one with people who are kind of wringing their hands and exclaiming about what's going on. So it's nice to be with a group of people to really, it's time to really focus in and understand as well as we can what's going on and think about what we can do about it. So my contribution, which I think will build on some of the stuff that that John and Eric was just talking about, I want to talk a little bit about the political economy, what's happening in the political economy and how that relates to what we're seeing in Washington right now. BESI is a political economy center motivated by the idea that you really want to think about systems of economic power and systems of political power as being deeply intertwined, right? And that we often can't understand what's going on in either sphere without thinking about both of them simultaneously. So in just a few minutes, I want to try to do that here. And I want to start by just noting that we are in a new political economy, I think. I worked on an edited volume with some colleagues not very many years ago. It came out, I think, in 2021 or something. We're talking about the American political economy. And we were just talking earlier today on a Zoom call about how much revision we felt like would need to be done to try to understand the political economy that we're existing in now. All right, so start with this slide. This is federal campaign contributions. This is data from Adam Bonica at Stanford. The share of federal campaign contributions that come from, first of all, the top 100th of 1%, right? That seems like a pretty select group, but then underneath it, the share that comes from just the top 400 donors in the United States. And it's stunning, right, to see that over a quarter of all donations in federal elections are coming from just 400 donors. Right? And over 50% of donations are coming from the top 100th of 1% of donors. And you can see right around 2010, that's Citizens United decision. Right? And I think analysts would now say it wasn't just Citizens United. There were several court cases that in combination really sent a message to big money donors that the limits were off. Right? That you could pour huge amounts of money into politics, and of course, that's exactly what they've done. So that's one striking change, really dramatic change. But it's happening against a backdrop of, it's not just that it's a small fraction of people who are giving it. The amount of money that this small group of donors, potential donors, has is completely without precedent in human history. Right? So if you go back to 1983. The Forbes 400 list, who's the richest person? Gordon Getty, right? And this is taking inflation. It's not a story about inflation here. These are $25. His fortune, $6 billion. Okay, so last year, Elon Musk's wealth increased just in the year 2024 by more than 30 times the amount of Gordon Getty's entire fortune. Right? And he is not alone. He was like, had the best year, right? But Zuckerberg, Bezos, these others, gains of 60 to 80 billion dollars just last year. So, you know, we have never seen anything like this. So when people say that Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, fortune of $421 billion, he is by far the richest person the world has ever seen. It's just, and so just thinking a little bit like what is happening here to the structure of the economy, there are really dramatic changes going on here. So this is just net worth of the richest billionaires at the beginning of last year, and then how much they gained over the course of the year. And you can see the big gains are really concentrated. So, and this has so often been the case ever since the work of Piketty and Sias came out looking at this allowing us to examine this top end inequality, right? Is that it's fractal. Like, so if you look at, so people talk about the top 10%, but the gains to the top 10%, like the bulk of them are within the top 10th of the top 10%. And then if you look at the top 1%, the bulk of the gains are in the top 10th of the top 1%. If you look at the top 10th of 1%, the bulk of the gains are in the top 10th of that, right? And you can just keep going on like that. And in addition, you can see here, so the blue dots, those are people who are involved in some way in tech, right? So incredibly concentrated by individuals and incredibly concentrated in the parts of the economy where this is happening. The gains are really, really concentrated, even within these very top groups. Okay, how does this translate into politics? A lot of you have probably seen this picture, right? Trump is giving his inaugural address, and behind him you've got the first row, which is the family members, plus the former presidents and their spouses. And the third row is cabinet members, right? So you can see little Marco trying to crowd into the picture there in the corner, right? But the second row was the plutocrats, right? The three richest men in the history of the world, right? On the stage behind President Trump. And actually 5 of the 7 richest people in the world on that stage, along with, you know, a lot of other really prominent people from this class as well. Okay, so the question though, and I'm just going to pose this, don't have time here to answer it, but like, so does that mean these guys are running the show? Jacob Hacker and I wrote a book a few years ago called Let Them Eat Tweets, where we talked about plutocratic populism, where I don't want to dumb down the argument too much, but we kind of did say, like, yeah, the plutocrats are super powerful, right? They're super powerful. They have a lot of influence over the Republican Party. And so even with Donald Trump in the White House, you get a situation where they're speaking in populist terms, but most of what they're doing is really good for the plutocrats, right? Big tax cuts, manning the Supreme Court with people who are going to do things that the business community is really going to love. Mitch McConnell called 2017 the best year for Republicans in his lifetime. And it wasn't because of the populist stuff. Charles Koch said something very similar, right? So we might think like those people are running the show, but is that actually what's going on here? So Steve Bannon looks at this scene and says, Trump broke them. They're not just up there. It's not a display of their power. It's a display of his power, right? So how do we think about this? I do think this is just an absolutely critical question. So one way to think about it is they are bending the knee, right? Game of Thrones, if you watch Game of Thrones, all they talk about is bending the knee. Like, did he bend the knee? Why won't she bend the knee? Like, if only he had bent the knee, right? You better bend the knee, right? And a lot of Trump's politics looks like that, right? Displays of domination, showing that he is in control. So how do we think about the relationship between these plutocrats and Donald Trump? And I think kind of a cop-out to say, but what we need to analyze, that the influence runs both ways, right? And put Elon and Musk aside, he's in a category all by himself, right, that we can analyze. But a lot of these other guys, right? So it's interesting, Ezra Klein is noted this, that the people who are up there on the stage behind him, in addition to like the 3 richest people in the world, a lot of them were people who are attention merchants, right? Who are involved in running these really important platforms. And these platforms, they generate vast wealth, right? That's part of what we saw in those earlier slides. This unbelievable wealth that's being concentrated, right? But they also generate vulnerability, you know, and I think that's the thing that I really want to emphasize here, is that they're vulnerable to what we might call regulatory mobsterism. Right? Nice company you've got there, nice platform you've got there. It'd be a shame if anything were to happen to it, right? So I think in thinking about these people, and this, you could extend this, we really need to think hard about the political economy of the media, not just the platforms that I'm talking about, but more broadly the media. The comparative work on democratic backsliding, I think, suggests very strongly that capture of media is often a crucial vehicle through which democratic backsliding occurs. Look at cases like India or Hungary, and you can see that really clearly. So if you think about these modern plutocrats, right, there are 2 things I think that you need to remember and think, trying to analyze what's going on here. One is to remember how they make their money, right? You know, and their ability to situate themselves between a bunch of companies, a bunch of producers, and a bunch of consumers. Like, that's the fact that they can occupy that position has been a way of gaining enormous wealth. But it also makes them vulnerable, right, to how the government is being operated. And so in thinking about their role, we also need to recognize that the breakdown of the guardrails, right, the breakdown of our institutional guardrails. So here's the political part of the political economy story, right? So Congress is not going to protect them. The regulators are not going to protect them. They work for Donald Trump now. The courts are probably not going to protect them, right? So they are powerful, wealthy, but also potentially quite vulnerable. Right? So again, I think fear is an important element here. So, and again, I think it's a complicated story, certainly with Musk, but also with some of these other people, like who's influencing whom. But just remember, we often talk about modern Russia as being oligarchic, as being an oligarchy with these like super rich guys running around, right? But there's no question who's got the power there. So even though I wrote, you know, not so long ago saying, yeah, the plutocrats really have enormous power, I think the situation now, precisely because these guardrails have broken down, right? There are no checks on Donald Trump. And with no checks on Donald Trump, the balance of power between the economic sphere and the political sphere, I think, changes quite dramatically.
Thanks to Paul Pearson. So far, everybody's an Americanist, and Paul Pearson started as a comparativist, but we have a real comparativist and expert in comparative democracy, Susan Hyde, to close us out.
Technically, here counts as an international relations person, so I'm just still debating where I'm going to take this, so beware. Okay, so thanks, Jake. I've been, yeah, sorry. I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk. I've been invited to come talk about U.S. politics. I've been in a lot of panels with Americanists over the last 5, 6, 8 years, I guess. And even in 2020, a co-author and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, the only time I've gotten to do that, called Trump Didn't Destroy Our Democracy, but Did He Fatally Weaken It? And in that op-ed, we toyed with this metaphor, and we picked on the term democratic backsliding. So there's a reason why I'm talking about this. We said, we don't like the term democratic backsliding or democratic erosion because it conjures up the wrong metaphor. We say, it says something about democracy that we don't agree with. It says that democratic erosion makes me think of sort of a cliff that's sort of falling apart. You know, once it's gone, right? You can't really build back a cliff that is eroded. It's just falling apart and it falls into the ocean and washes away. And democratic backsliding, similarly, kind of like you trying to push a snowball up a hill or something. And once it rolls back down, it's very hard to roll it back up again or something. And we pose this other way of thinking about it, which is that democracy is this resilient thing, right? It's like a forest or something like this, and it can be damaged. It can be damaged by, an infestation of insects or a windstorm or something like this. But if you do it right, you can build it back. It can be resilient to threats, right? Democracy can be threatened. Democracy can be threatened, but it can come back. And how does it come back? It comes back through lots of things, maybe through the citizenry mostly. We can talk about this. And we were just texting today, and we were like, man, I think we've not been sure. The op-ed has aged okay, but I think maybe he fatally weakened democracy, right? I think maybe Trump finally did it. And I think maybe he's in there with some clear cutting, right? And it's gonna be a long time before. So there's a lot of ways to think about it. But then right before the panel, my colleague Jonah Levy came up and said, can you please try to be more positive than 1984 Orwell? So then I was thinking at the beginning of the panel, like, how can I be more positive than 1984 Orwell? And so here we go. Oh, you said Animal Farm. Okay, sorry. You said, okay. More positive than Animal Farm. Okay, that's a slightly different. I wrote down the wrong Orwell. So democracy is still better than autocracy because it can be resilient. I'm going to just make a definitional point as a comparativist and as an IR person. Democracy is a system of government that requires, in its most conservative definition, 2 or more parties that when they lose elections, they accept defeat. Just throwing that out there. It's a definitional point. Might have no relevance, might have some relevance. I say that because one of the problems that I'm not seeing that many people talk about is that the Democratic Party in this country cannot solve this alone because of the definitional point. This is an academic point, right? This is not a partisan point. I can say that same point about any country in the world. Democracy is a system of government with 2 parties, both of which, if they lose the election, have to accept the result. That is the definition. So just that's one point. However, I'm also very much into these theories of self-enforcing democracy. If you're familiar with them, they rest very much on the people, right? If the people don't care if they live in a democracy, then we're stuck. A big part of self-enforcing democracy, however, is that people have enough information available to them to make an assessment about whether an election result was accurate, and whether, if an election was stolen, for example, they can tell the difference between one that was really stolen or one that was just a sore loser complaining about it. And in the case of real threats to democracy, not just stolen elections, but any sort of real threats, there's some common set of facts that they can use to judge that information and then rise up to defend democracy. So I think you were talking about the collective action, but that's why the media system being broken is so important, right? Again, talking as sort of a comparativist here. I don't know exactly how to fix that. I'll talk about that in a second. So that's like sort of positive. I don't know, Jonah, how I'm doing here. Their self-enforcing democracy has worked under lots of really oppressive conditions around the world, under lots of threats of violence, under lots of people dying, under lots of people going to prison, under lots of people disappearing in the night. These are things that can happen, right? It's happened before. I'm not saying that that's going to happen here. I'm not talking about the United States right now, but I'm just saying this is the theory that we're basing some of our theories of self-enforcing democracy on. Democracy is better than autocracy because it is resilient. It is not immune to electing bad leaders. The good part about it is that it can correct, it can have this sort of constitutional mechanism for getting rid of those bad leaders. But one of the things that you have to think about is if you go off the rails a little bit under democracy, you have to think about who will stop the process of threats to democracy, or who will get in the way of that. And I think others on the panel have talked about that already. It's very hard when one of those people is the richest person ever. I don't know what we do about that. So that's something to think about. I'm going to say some very small ideas that are more manageable for me to think about. One of the things that we think helps is to talk to people that you disagree with, to join groups that are not the same group that everyone you already knows also joins. So we call these cross-cutting cleavages in comparative politics, right? It's better if your life is not perfectly organized in exactly the same way as everyone else you know. I think that there's, am I going on too long? I would like it personally, given recent experiences in my own life, if someone would figure out a way for anti-harassment technology to be invented, and something to protect us from the exact type of harassment that Eric was talking about. I think it would be helpful for our Republican congressional leaders, and I think it might also be helpful for, say, academics that are talking about this stuff and that are on lists. I think it would be nice to have a little bit of messaging out there that I wish it would get through to more people, that could remind our fellow Americans that our worst enemies are not each other. Because they're not, but there's this thing going around right now that the biggest threats that we have are each other, and that's not a thing. If I have a second, I'll talk about foreign policy, because that's something I'm really interested in too. One of the things that this particular democratic threat is increasing is threats from abroad, right? The particular strategy that the current administration is adopting so rapidly is just a house fire of our, what used to be called the values-based foreign policy. And I do not think US foreign policy has been, it has always been hypocritical. It has always had a dark underbelly. It has always done things that I think many people disagree with. However, the alternative is much, much, much worse. And bludgeoning our security allies with economic policy makes it very rational for them to make other plans. I could go on about that for a long time as an IR person, but I think the exercise of bullying as a foreign policy strategy is not something that I think will work for very long. And I think that will potentially feed back into US domestic politics in a way that I don't think many Americans will enjoy the experience of, at least those who like, well, I can't go into it with the time I have, but I'm just going to stop there. So, yeah, I think it will affect a lot of things that people enjoy. I know I didn't go on for too long, but I'm going to stop there. So,
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Hyde. Okay. I'm going to call on some people for Q&A and potentially collect a couple questions depending on the queue. Let's go back to Terry and Sarang, I guess.
I've been reading a little bit about FDR and his first 100 days, and there wasn't a lot of opposition to him in his first 100 days. People were calling out, "We're so happy we have a dictator." And a lot of the Republican opposition came later in 1938, 1937. So I just wonder, do we just need to wait for more opposition?
Thanks, Terry. Let's do one more. Sarang.
Yeah, so something that's been on my mind is the Federalist number 78 problem. That's the one where Hamilton says that the judicial branch is the weakest compared to the other two branches because it neither has the power of coercion or the power of the purse. And one of the things that I really would like to know, or at least forecast would happen, is what happens if there is continued non-observance of what the courts say. The judiciary doesn't exactly have its own coercive powers. I mean, it has like some legal powers it can sanction lawyers for the DOJ and things like that. But like, I'm very curious to know what happens next in that situation.
Great, let's start with that FDR's first 100 days and letting the, court's made its ruling, let them enforce it, challenge.
All right, I'll take that first question. Yeah, it's certainly the case that there are prior periods, and that would be the best one, where Republican institutions are under threat. I mean, if you think about the Depression, which at the time had been going on for 4 years since the stock market crash, unemployment 25%, it's around the, lots of concerns about whether democracy is even compatible with economic recovery and growth. So clear, this is not the only moment in which there was a threat, but a couple things that I'd say. One is, even during the 100 days, FDR's under, and even as he makes some dramatic assertions of power, it's also the case he's responding to things coming up in Congress. So like the NRA, his big initiative is his effort to get in front of Congress. There was more populism, more, he's in a sense trying to, part of FDR in those first 100 days is trying to prevent something more radical even from happening, given the conditions on the ground, the bonus marches in 1932, early 33. So I think it's a very different context and positioning of the president relative to that, but it's certainly the case. Over time, Roosevelt makes incredibly expansive presidential power claims, and while it's true in those first 100 days, they don't come under severe challenge in the same way, they do over time. And I mean, certainly court packing in 37. And just think about the context. There are 16 Senate Republicans in 1937. 16. Roosevelt's won the most dramatic landslide in American history. And when he tries to expand the Supreme Court, tries to reorganize the executive branch, he gets pushed back and defeated, right? And I guess I would point to that as yes, this is a recurrent pattern of presidents trying to overstep, though I would argue non-comparable quite to this. But the response of pushback has come in these prior episodes as well.
On the court briefly, this is obviously one of the big questions. And Jake rightly referenced the Andrew Jackson quip, probably apocryphal, that the Chief Justice has made his decision, let him enforce it, that what can be done around judicial enforcement. And there are issues of contempt, there are some legal mechanisms, but I think ultimately it will be political. I think if we see greater, more overt, more flagrant disobedience, especially of a Supreme Court decision, I think we'll get questions around, does the Supreme Court speak out? Do you see justices taking to the newspapers? I think unlikely, but not impossible. Are there marches on the streets? What do those look like? How do the politics change? And most importantly, what happens in Congress, in particular in the Senate? And we saw a brief moment after January 6th where Senate Republicans broke with Trump in ways they hadn't previously. Most of them came back home, not all. Of those who didn't come back home, some are no longer in office. Think about Mitt Romney. But I do think that is the question, one of the things I'll be watching for is like, will he overplay his hand? And will he overplay his hand in a way that will finally, despite all of the polarization and internal dynamics within the Republican Party that Eric and Paul and others have written about, lead to real kind of breaking ranks in the Republican Party? That could be over disobedience of a court order. It might not be. It could be if he does tariffs, which cause prices to rise dramatically, and kind of it could be a set of economic variables that cause folks to break ranks. But I do think tough for me to imagine the Republican Party being more consolidated behind Trump than it is right now. So to some extent, if there's a kind of modicum of a happy story I can tell on this kind of very unhappy occasion, is something along the lines of kind of there's nowhere to go but down. And given how thin margins are in House and Senate, it's possible that if he disobeys the Supreme Court and even 3 or 4 Republican senators decide to start holding up nominees or the budget or things that they have thus far shown no real interest in doing, that would be a different ballgame. So the court can't enforce on its own, but potentially other actors can.
Just say 2 things at this point quickly. One is, I find it very unsettling to be waiting for the Roberts Court to ride to our rescue. You know, I have not seen anything really from the Supreme Court in quite a long time that makes me think, like, it may happen on some cases, but I think, you know, we need to remember what kind of court this is, and we need to remember that some of the arguments about nationalized polarization and partisanship across these, a lot of what Eric was saying about Congress, you could say just as well about the Supreme Court. So, you know, I have some hope about that, but I don't have a lot of optimism about it. And then the other thing I was saying comes to Terry's point about how the opposition came later in the New Deal. You know, we live in an age of backlash politics. Like, if you think about the last 20 years or so, there are like so many cases, right, where one party seems like they've really gotten the upper hand, and they're starting to write, you know, there's starting to be these punditry pieces about how they're going to be the hegemon, right? And it lasts, and the half-life of those expectations, whether you're talking about George W. Bush or you're talking about Barack Obama, the half-life has been very short, right? And a lot of things they're going to do are going to be unpopular. I think that's, you know, Elon Musk is not popular, right? So I think that, you know, one of the really critical questions is, do we still live in a moment of sufficiently normal politics so that kind of backlash dynamic can actually play itself out? Right? And I think there's a lot of reason to have, you know, deep concerns and questions about that. Whether you're talking about the media, whether you're talking about the structure of law enforcement, whether you're thinking about the incentives of the business community, you know, the role of fear and the fact that, like, if you're on this side, you get the carrot, and if you're on that side, you get the stick. Right? I wonder a lot about whether the kind of dynamics that we've seen in recent political history will still apply. But if I wanted to be optimistic, I think that is what I would point to, that we've seen political leaders in this country look like they're riding high, and it doesn't last very long.
Do you want to jump in?
No, you go first.
I was going to just add two things. One is, last week I was on a panel that was doing a 2025 economic forecast at the Commonwealth Club with no business being on either. But it was both a bunch of economists and banking people and whatever. And I realized that all of them were confidently assuming that almost 90% of what Trump was doing was just not going to happen. Insane. And for what it's worth, they seem to be very confident in that, in those assertions. And so, you know, there's this whole other world of non-political scientists who seem to be quite like putting a lot of money in that space. So on the one hand, I want to say that, and then from the comparative perspective, on a totally different extreme, not about the United States, I wanted to say that another actor that we just haven't brought up or talked about or thought about really is that's quite active in these conversations about real threats to democracy and rule of law and the constitutional order in some other countries that have had major problems, is the military. Just throwing it out there. Not saying anything about this country, but
Tossing a grenade, leaving
yeah.
Eric, you want
I was just going to add one point in terms of the backlash point to Paul's discussion of that, and that's just that even if there is a backlash that's effective electorally, a lot of just some of the implications are just going to be, I want to say, with us for more than a generation. And I think in particular, destroying the civil service administrative state is, I actually think that what's happening is a kind of regime shift in the following sense. Even if somebody thinks, you know, lots of people are losing jobs, lots of people are having their conditions of employment made miserable, and so a lot of people are going to leave. And the problem is, in 4 years, say some Democrat is elected president with a Democratic Congress. If you're a college grad and you're thinking about going into government service as a secure career where I'm not going to make as much money as in the private sector, but I'll at least have job security and be able to use my expertise for a long term, you just can no longer do that if this happens, period. And in terms, that's administrative capacity that's taken was a torturous process to build in the late 19th, early to mid 20th century. That took a long time, and it's being wrecked in a way that I just don't, is not going to be fixable in the short term. That's what I would say.
I'll take my prerogative to say one other just norm shifts, that will be lasting for generations is elites who learned, there was uncertainty, what would happen if you try a coup? Now it is perfectly predicted, your life goes better and everything goes better for you. And that's an elite norm signal that's going to be long-term in the US. Let's take a couple more. Let's go.
Hi, I just wanted to bring the topic of technological capacity and the innovative capacity that I feel like has been a little bit not the center of the focus in our discussion to democratic backsliding. And I feel like to an extent we are taking the innovative capacity as granted, although it has been the source of a lot of economic surplus and productivity growth that probably feeds into our stability of democratic system. And considering the recent changes, I was wondering if the weakening of the institutions probably limits the technological capacity because considering the monopolies of the tech firms or weakening investment towards the education, probably in the future, we might have a recovery of the democratic system, but there might be a lessening of the technological capacities, which may have further impacts. So I was wondering if you may have any thoughts on this
Thank you
regard.
for that question. U.S. anti-democratic action through abroad and issues of sort of technological shocks and innovation and sort of the tech economy structure.
And whether they think the U.S. is capable of
Yeah,
introspection.
right. Thank you.
I mean, I don't think this is the time to expect a lot of US introspection, but perhaps someday we can hope. Structure, I mean, I think we're just headed towards really uncertain times. Like, I'm not in a position to make a lot of prediction right now. I think we're all doing a lot of hope. I do hope that, like, if we want US democratization going forward, I think that two things that would be helpful are doing something about the massive income inequality that we've experienced. This is something that's true. I mean, one thing I think I can make a point about is that lots and lots of countries in the world are experiencing threats to democracy. And so we're looking for common causes because the trend is in many places. And so a couple of things are happening in a lot of places. One is the media environment. And the tech companies, I can tell a lot of stories about the role that Facebook is playing, not just in, providing weird information, but in really messing up the legal environment that opposition politicians face when they receive death threats, for example, that they can't actually prosecute them in any way because they have to go through Facebook in Russia. Where a lot of the other disinformation against their party and themselves is coming from. So against their pro-democracy movements are coming from. So there's a lot of ways in which the tech companies are really anti-democracy around the world as well. But I don't really know how to think about I can't predict the future on that front, but I would say that the democracy should address. It would be good for democracy if we can address the disinformation in the media environment. I think that would be good for democracy, and I think it would also be good for us to be able to address the massive and unprecedented income inequality in many countries around the world.
And just in the interest of time, I'm going to be really selective and just talk about this question about democracy in the U.S. So I just taught a class this morning in which I made the point that, really good argument that the U.S. was not a democracy prior to 1965. And interestingly, and Eric and I talk about this in the book, it's not long after 1965 when the political system starts to wobble. Actually, like the roots of polarization come right out of that same period, right? So there absolutely is a lot to wrestle with there. At the same time, I think there's a big difference between the system that has operated in the United States over many years the institutions that have operated in the United States over many years, and the institutions that operate in, say, Russia, right? And critically, can't remember who said this before, maybe it was you, Susan, it's like, just like a very minimalist definition of democracy, like does the side that lost the election hand over power, right?
And there are two parties.
Are there, yeah, so,
Two or more parties.
you know, and I think a lot of political scientists, you know, some would say it is cynical, have a very minimalist idea of what democracy is about, right? That it is not really about like citizen rule and high levels of responsiveness to citizens, but it does involve some systematic system of circulation of elites so that like certain groups are not able to consolidate permanent power and use the state as their weapon. So, so I think one can both acknowledge all the many limitations, past and present, past and recent past of American democracy, and still be extremely alarmed about what's going on right now.
Eric, you're gonna?
That's it.
All right,
I'll-
cool. Let's
I
get a
can
couple
pause.
more. Let's do the two in this row right here. Yeah, that row on the left. Yeah, great. Thank you.
My question is quite simple. Do you think there is a way of moving forward without violence if they are not going to respect the courts, if they're impeached, and we have already seen that sometimes they don't fully recognize they lose elections? Do you see a way out of this without violence?
I know Trump has floated the idea of a third term, and with the Republicans controlling all branches, as well as the new Secretary of Defense being a pretty Trump loyalist, what are the checks and balances that will prevent that, and what is the likelihood of Trump trying to go for third term? Because I know FDR, if I recall correctly, had a fourth term as well, but that was a different circumstance, and who knows what Trump will do. So, yeah, that's my question.
That's a political violence and more Trump terms.
I'm happy to start on, I'll take in some ways, the easier question, which is the third term question, and defer the violence question to others. So President Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms, which was in violation of what seems to have been a norm, though the exact contours of the norm are complicated. But he was the first president elected more than twice, after which there was a constitutional amendment barring a president from serving basically more than 10 years, more than 2 full terms, or if they happen to take office during a predecessor's term. So it seems very clear, based on constitutional text, ratification history, every conceivable kind of mainstream legal source, that President Trump could not run for a third term, period, full stop. The question then becomes, what if he tries? I mean, he can get up there and hold a press conference and throw a big rally and say, I'm running. And what I suspect would happen would be what we have seen with a number of other non-electoral issues, which is there would be controversy and litigation and questions about respect or disrespect for the outcomes of that. So some state secretaries of state would put him on the ballot. They would be challenged for doing so. Some would refuse to put him on the ballot. They would be challenged for doing so. We would have litigation kind of bubbling up across the country. We would probably get I would hope we would only get rulings one way, but in practice, we probably get rulings in competing directions. The Supreme Court would eventually resolve it. I think even this court, and I share Paul's general low esteem for the Roberts Court, but I think even this court would say that the relevant constitutional text, 2 terms means 2 terms. Then the question is, would we get disobedience of that by some subset of secretaries of state? I think it is less, I have more optimism in the court being able to hold its own against state level disobedience than federal level disobedience. Also, if some of the key swing states have Democratic secretaries of state who would not put Trump, who would honor the decision even if others wouldn't, it would be, you could imagine a case where he's only on the ballot in 20 states and thus can't win. So I think it would be extremely messy. There would be litigation. I think if we get to the level of disobedience of I'm going to run for a third term despite the constitutional bar, you're probably also at the level of disobedience of I'm going to disobey court orders saying I can't. So I think that's a pretty dark place, and it would be fought out kind of retail state by state.
I can take the violence question, I guess. So I study election violence a little bit, and the description that Professor Schickler gave of the intimidation within the Republican Party is what I would consider meets the definition of political violence already, in terms of what we talk about. So no. But if you're talking about civil war or something like that, I think the road to that is pretty long. It's a really big country, and just the sort of contemporary weapons, I think that we're pretty far from that. IR people think nukes have changed a lot. There's already a lot of political violence in the United States, and so we've sort of crossed that bridge already. But in terms of thinking about something like a whole other level of secession or civil war or something like that, I don't know. I don't know. But yes, we already have political violence here.
I just wanted to make one really quick point, which is we sometimes think of the only alternative is pouring into the streets. I just want to introduce the term general strike, which is if there were enough unhappiness, sometimes going into the streets would not be as smart as everyone staying home. So I'd like people to talk that up when the time comes.
All right. Let's do these three right here, and we'll close it out. Please keep your questions and comments incredibly brief so we can go back to the panel one more time and hear your three questions. Yes, please.
So I read some poll results recently of Trump, a national poll, indicating that most people think what he's done so far in terms of policies is good. More than 50% have indicated that. I mean, there's a lot of disapproval, but more than between 50 and 60% approve of what he's done so far. So what is the implication of that in terms of democracy, in terms of moving forward?
Yeah, I want to go back to kind of the underpinning trends that Paul Pearson and Eric Schickler, you identify in your book about, and your latest book about the nationalization of the political conversation, and which is largely due to the erosion of the local press. And so, we're tempted to kind of have knee-jerk reactions with everything that's coming our way. But if we want to go back to this more fundamental problem, is this still worth addressing? Is this still something that can be addressed in parallel to all our knee-jerk reactions to go back to the status quo, the normal status quo? Is it something that can still be addressed, say, by approaching philanthropists to have them fund municipal presses or small presses across the world, or across the US, or is the well already poisoned in such a way that everyone's hooked on Newsmax and Fox News?
Political economy. Let's just close out right here and go back to our panel.
Could you briefly talk about how some paleoconservative, like academicians, like Patrick Deenan, have advocated for, like, the experiment of democracy for the past 250 years has shown its inefficiency, and we need to try something that's more like Hungary, or there's like this aspiration for an experimental authoritarian regime, and they don't really necessarily take into the implication.
Great call. Thanks for these questions. Thank you. We'll close out with our panel. I'll take the host prerogative to just say one of the fascinating things about this particular moment is a coalition that has like venerated the Constitution so much, running over it, just like a coalition that has been nativist populist movement being led by a foreign billionaire cutting Head Start funds and so forth. The ironies and contradictions there are very fascinating, and the theorists on the right who really are saying, there are so many immigrants, wokeness has gone so far, we are suspending the Constitution for these crises that we perceive. That is at least that coherent fascism. The incoherence of modern internet fascism is a whole nother thing. Now I'll turn it to the panel. That was my
Yeah, Very, very briefly, on Hungary, I think it's really important to pay attention to the ways in which members of Trump world are quite self-consciously modeling the agenda on what's happened in Hungary and elsewhere. And I think the world tells a complicated story. You've got one story in Hungary, you've got a different story in Poland, a different story in India, a different story in Brazil. And I, for one, have been doing much more comparative reading in the last couple of years than ever before. And I think we would all benefit from the same. On the poll numbers, I think those numbers are in some ways soft. It's the beginning of the presidency. We haven't seen consequences yet. So I think the two things I would note is, one, what happens when we see actual consequences of his policies? I mean, look at what happened, the kind of enormous tanking of his numbers during mismanagement of COVID last time around. And I suspect we'll see that happen, not in year 4, but in sometime later in year 1 this time around. Also, I'd be curious, are the numbers because of or in spite of the undemocratic character of a lot that's happening? Then I think it's very different to say I like him because I like tariffs or because I like this, that, and the other policy versus I like him because he's pledged to disobey the court on something. I think those are very different. And I'd be curious to kind of see and hear more on that, and my alarm would vary accordingly.
I'll just also say that Levitsky and Ziblatt have really doubled down on that. American majorities, for the most part, have coincided with support for democratic institutions, and many of the threats have been historically minoritarian, and that gives me a tiny bit of faith in sort of mass preferences.
Just really quickly on, a change in approval ratings that's pretty dramatic is going to be necessary, but not sufficient to give any hope of a substantial congressional response. We saw Republicans stick with Trump quite clearly in his first term when his approval rating was down to about 40, 38, 39%. So I think that's necessary. That would have to change, and that does bring in the media and how people consume the news and information. The question, I certainly think local news and information is valuable. I think the scale of the problem right now in terms of people getting and accurate information and attending to it is just massive. It's going to take massive real-world consequences in people's everyday lives, which I do think are likely to happen, to really get a shift.
Yeah, I also want to comment on this question about popularity, and I'll just start by saying thank you for coming and for your questions and comments. We live in a kind of anti-system, anti-institutions moment, right? Henry Brady has written about this, others too. Trust in institutions is super low in many cases for pretty good reasons, I would say, based on recent performance. And obviously that's a big advantage, for a party that comes in and somebody, I think it was Kara Swisher I heard say the other day, they never say what they're actually going to do, like how they're going to fix healthcare or whatever it is, right? They just trash things, right? But there it's a moment where there's a lot of openness to that. But it's important. So I may be seeing different polls than you, but I follow 538. I check what his approval rating is all the time. Hasn't, at least I didn't check today, but as of yesterday, it was under 50%. And I think he's the first president in the period where they've been doing approvals who, even at the beginning of his term, could not break 50% in approval ratings. A lot of people really don't like Donald Trump, right? And so that is important to remember. They were smart to start with USAID, right? People, but Musk is now tweeting about Social Security. Right, and that's a different matter when you start. So they're gonna be taking. They're probably smart enough not to take a hammer to Social Security, but they're going to start hammering on things that are going to be damaging and are going to be a lot more popular. So, and of course, what Congress wants to do, massive cuts in healthcare spending in order to fund tax cuts for the rich. That was. Aside from COVID, the other time in the first term when Trump's approval rating really dipped was when they did exactly that, right? One of the most unpopular initiatives in the modern history of Congress, right? So I think they're a lot less popular, and that there's potential for them to become even less popular moving forward.
Well, Susan, take us out. Last word.
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think they have they have it in them to make unpopular decisions. There's a lot of things that could happen. Right now, I think we're just seeing a lot of chaos. And it's hard to pay attention to all of it. That seems to be part of the strategy. And I do think that right now, for my own sanity, I'm trying to act local. And I encourage everyone to do the same. So.
Thank you again to our panelists, John Gould, Eric Schickler, Paul Pearson, Susan Hyde. Thank you to all for being here.